London, 1814. The last of the coal had burned away hours ago, leaving the small cottage parlour in a chill that matched Seraphina Thornvale's mood. She pulled her worn shawl tighter around her shoulders and stared at the letter on her lap, its official seal broken, but its implications still intact. The elegant script bore the crest of the Earl of Blackvale, a raven perched upon a crown of thorns, the very symbol that had haunted her nightmares for 5 long years. Through the cottage window, morning mist clung to the modest garden that had once been her mother's pride. How different from the sprawling grounds of Thornvale Manor, now in the possession of the man whose name was signed at the bottom of the letter. Seraphina traced her finger over the bold signature, Alaric, Earl of Blackvale. The proposition was as simple as it was preposterous. Marriage. The Earl of Blackvale wished to make her his countess. The man who had orchestrated her family's downfall now sought her hand, offering the restoration of her family name and a portion of their lands in exchange. Miss, her maid Agnes, appeared in the doorway, her face lined with worry. Your pupil has arrived for her lesson. Seraphina folded the letter and tucked it into her pocket. Thank you, Agnes. I shall be there directly. The piano in the parlour was the last vestige of her former life, saved from auction by the kindness of Lady Evelinda Quillheart, her mother's dearest friend. It was upon this instrument that Seraphina now earned her living, teaching the daughters of merchants who aspired to gentility. Young Miss Pemberton waited by the piano, her feet dangling above the floor. Good morning, Miss Thornvale, she chirped, unaware of the turmoil in her teacher's mind. Good morning, Charlotte. Shall we begin with our scales? For the next hour, Seraphina guided small fingers across ivory keys, correcting posture and tempo while her thoughts remained fixed on the Earl's proposal. When the lesson concluded and Charlotte departed, Seraphina returned to the letter, reading it once more as though its contents might have changed. She moved to her father's old desk, pulled out a fresh sheet of paper, and dipped her pen in ink. What would her father say? Baron Thornvale had been a proud man, respected throughout the county, until accusations of treason stripped him of title and lands. He had died of grief within a year, her mother following shortly after, leaving Seraphina alone with nothing but a tarnished name. Am I truly considering this? She whispered to the empty room. A knock at the door startled her. Agnes appeared with another letter. From Lady Quillheart, Miss. Seraphina broke the seal and unfolded the paper, recognizing Lady Evelinda's elegant script. My dearest Seraphina, word has reached me of the Earl's proposal. I understand the shock you must feel. Perhaps it would ease your mind to take tea with me tomorrow. There are matters concerning the Earl that you should know before making your decision. With deepest affection, Lady Evelinda Quillheart. Seraphina let the letter fall to her lap. What could Lady Quillheart know of the Earl that might influence her decision? The woman had been her mother's confidant and had shown Seraphina nothing but kindness since her parents' passing. Agnes cleared her throat. Begging your pardon, miss, but Mr. Finch came by earlier. He says the roof needs mending before winter sets in. The roof, Seraphina sighed, another expense she could ill afford. Her gaze drifted to the tiny garden where her mother's roses once flourished, now withered from neglect. The cottage, once a summer retreat for the Thornvale family, had become her prison and sanctuary all at once. She stood and moved to the window, watching as the afternoon light caught the last leaves of autumn. Somewhere beyond the hills lay Thornvale Manor, her childhood home, now occupied by the Earl. Did he walk its halls with the same cruel indifference with which he had claimed it? Did he ever think of the family he had destroyed? Her father's voice seemed to whisper from the shadows. A Thornvale never bends. But her father was gone, and with him, the luxury of pride. Seraphina returned to the desk and began to write, her pen scratching against the paper with grim determination. If this marriage was her only path to reclaiming what was rightfully hers, then so be it. She would enter the lion's den willingly, with vengeance in her heart. As she sealed her response, accepting the Earl of Blackvale's proposal, Seraphina felt something harden within her. The girl who had once danced in moonlit gardens was gone, replaced by a woman with steel in her veins. Agnes, she called, her voice steady. Please have this delivered to Blackvale House immediately. The maid took the letter, concern etched on her weathered face. Are you certain, miss? Seraphina met her gaze unflinchingly. I am certain only of this. I will reclaim what was taken from us by whatever means necessary. As Agnes departed with the letter that would seal her fate, Seraphina turned to the portrait of her parents that hung above the fireplace. Their eyes seemed to follow her, questioning her decision. Forgive me, she whispered, but I will see our name restored, even if I must become a Blackvale to do it." The carriage bearing the Blackvale insignia arrived precisely at noon, its polished exterior gleaming against the winter landscape. Serafina watched from her bedroom window as the driver, adorned in the Earl's livery, descended to open the door. She had expected a lady's maid or perhaps a housekeeper. Instead, a tall figure emerged, his greatcoat billowing around him like dark wings. The Earl of Blackvale had come himself. Serafina's heart quickened. She had not anticipated meeting him until the wedding ceremony, planned for 3 days hence at the Earl's London residence. Yet there he stood, surveying her modest cottage with an inscrutable expression. "Miss," Agnes whispered from the doorway, "his lordship requests an audience." Serafina smoothed her best dress, a pale blue muslin, woefully out of fashion, but the finest she possessed. "Tell his lordship I shall join him momentarily." She descended the stairs with measured steps, one hand trailing the banister for support. In the small parlor, the Earl stood by the window, his back to her. He was taller than she remembered from their brief encounter at her father's trial 5 years ago. Then he had been merely the son of the late Earl, testifying against her father with cold precision. Now he dominated the modest room, his presence making it seem smaller still. "Lord Blackvale," she announced herself, pride forcing steel into her voice. He turned, and Serafina fought to maintain her composure. The years had hardened his features, sharpening the angles of his face into something both aristocratic and severe. His eyes, grey as winter mist, assessed her with unsettling thoroughness. "Miss Thornvale," he bowed, a perfect execution of courtesy without warmth. "I trust my letter found you well." "As well as can be expected, my lord, given the circumstances of our arrangement." A flicker of something amusement, annoyance, crossed his face. "Indeed, I thought it prudent to discuss certain matters before our nuptials, such as whether you fully comprehend what this marriage entails." Serafina lifted her chin. "I believe your letter was quite explicit, my lord. You offer restoration of a portion of my family's lands and the clearing of my father's name. In exchange, I am to become your countess. In title only," he clarified, his tone clipped. "This is a marriage of convenience, Miss Thornvale. I require a countess to fulfill certain social obligations and to provide an heir. I do not seek a love match. I assure you, Lord Blackvale, love is the furthest thing from my mind where you are concerned." His lips curved into what might have been a smile on a different man. "Then we understand each other." "Excellent." He moved closer, his steps deliberate. Serafina resisted the urge to retreat. "There will be those who question my choice," he continued. "The daughter of a disgraced baron is hardly the match society expects for the Earl of Blackvale. You will be subject to scrutiny, perhaps even cruelty. Are you prepared for that?" "I have endured society's cruelty for 5 years, my lord. I doubt marriage to you could worsen my situation." "Do not be so certain." His gaze narrowed. "As my countess, you will be expected to maintain impeccable decorum. Any scandal would reflect poorly on my name. The irony does not escape me, Lord Blackvale, that you speak of scandal while proposing to marry the daughter of the man you helped condemn." The Earl's jaw tightened. "Your father's crimes were his own, Miss Thornvale. My testimony merely revealed the truth." "The truth?" Serafina nearly spat the word. "Is that what you call it?" For a moment tension crackled between them like heat lightning before a storm. Then the Earl inclined his head, conceding the point without admitting fault. "The carriage will collect you on Wednesday morning. I have taken the liberty of arranging for a seamstress to attend you tomorrow. You cannot be married in—" His gaze swept over her dress, leaving the sentence unfinished, but its meaning clear. "How thoughtful of you to concern yourself with my appearance." "As I said, Miss Thornvale, certain expectations must be met." From his pocket, he withdrew a small velvet box. "The Blackvale betrothal ring. It has adorned the finger of every countess for 7 generations." He opened the box to reveal a sizable emerald surrounded by diamonds. The stones caught the weak winter light, casting green and white reflections across the faded wallpaper. "Your hand, if you please." Serafina extended her left hand, noting with dismay how it trembled slightly. The Earl took it in his own, his touch impersonal yet somehow intimate. The ring slid onto her finger, heavy with both weight and significance. "It is done," he said, releasing her hand. "Not quite, my lord. There is still the matter of the wedding." "A formality." He stepped back, reassuming the distance between them. "The papers are being drawn up as we speak. Your family's lands, or rather a portion of them, will be transferred to your name the day after our marriage." As for your father's reputation, I have connections in Parliament who can introduce a motion for posthumous exoneration. And what of Thornvale Manor itself? A shadow crossed the Earl's face. The manor remains mine. That is non-negotiable. Before Serafina could protest, he continued, You will, of course, have access to the East Wing, which I understand housed your mother's apartments. Consider it part of your settlement. The mention of her mother's room struck Serafina like a physical blow. How many hours had she spent there as a child, watching her mother arrange flowers or write correspondence? The thought of returning, not as the daughter of the house but as the wife of the man who now owned it, filled her with conflicting emotions. I must take my leave, the Earl said, checking his pocket watch. I have business in London before the wedding. Remember, Wednesday. I am unlikely to forget my own wedding day, my lord, however reluctant I may be to see it arrive. His eyes met hers, and for a brief moment, Serafina thought she glimpsed something beyond the coldness, perhaps a flicker of respect, or even understanding. Until Wednesday, Miss Thornvale. With a bow as precise as his speech, the Earl of Blackvale departed, leaving Serafina alone with the weight of his ring on her finger and the certainty that she had just sealed her fate. The wedding was a somber affair. No guests save the required witnesses, no flowers save a small posy of winter roses clutched in Serafina's gloved hands. The bride wore ivory silk, hastily tailored but elegant nonetheless, a final gift from Lady Quillheart, who had whispered cryptic warnings about the Earl that Serafina had been too distracted to fully comprehend. Now as the carriage bearing the newlyweds approached Blackvale House, Serafina pressed her forehead against the cold glass of the window, watching London's crowded streets give way to expansive countryside. The Earl sat opposite her, his attention fixed on documents spread across his lap. They had barely exchanged a dozen words since the ceremony. Darkness was falling when the carriage wheels finally crunched on the gravel drive of Blackvale House. A grand Georgian mansion loomed before them, its many windows glowing with welcome that seemed at odds with the building's imposing facade. "Welcome to Blackvale, Countess," the Earl said, the title sounding foreign on his lips. Servants lined the entrance, their expressions carefully neutral as they curtsied and bowed to their master and his new bride. Serafina nodded acknowledgement, conscious of their scrutiny. The housekeeper, a stately woman with silver-streaked hair, stepped forward. "I am Mrs. Quicksilver, my lady. I have overseen the household for 30 years. If you require anything, you need only ask." "Thank you, Mrs. Quicksilver." Serafina removed her gloves, revealing the emerald ring that now had a gold band as companion. "I should like to see my chambers, if you please." "Of course, my lady, though perhaps you would care for refreshment first. The journey from London is tiresome," the Earl interjected before Serafina could respond. "Have tea sent to the Countess's rooms, Mrs. Quicksilver. I shall be in my study." He turned to Serafina with a perfunctory bow. "I trust you will be comfortable. We shall dine at 8. With that, he strode away, leaving Serafina in the care of the housekeeper. Mrs. Quicksilver led her through corridors adorned with ancestral portraits, the Blackvale lineage watching with painted eyes as she passed. The woman maintained a steady stream of information, which corridors led where, which rooms were regularly used, which staff members handled which duties, but Serafina found herself struggling to absorb it all. "And these will be your apartments, my lady." Mrs. Quicksilver opened double doors to reveal a suite of rooms decorated in shades of emerald and cream. The Earl had them refurbished for your arrival. Serafina stepped inside, taking in the elegant furnishings, the fresh flowers, the delicate tea service already waiting on a small table by the fireplace. It was all impeccably tasteful, yet somehow impersonal, like a room in a fine hotel rather than a home. "His lordship's chambers adjoin yours through that door," Mrs. Quicksilver added, indicating a panelled wall, "though it is customary for it to remain locked unless invited." The implication hung in the air. Serafina felt heat rise to her cheeks, but kept her expression neutral. "I see. Thank you, Mrs. Quicksilver. I shall leave you to rest before dinner, my lady. Your new lady's maid, Clara, will attend you at 7. When the housekeeper departed, Serafina sank onto a chaise longue, suddenly exhausted. For all her preparations, for all her determination to face this marriage with strength, the reality of being the Countess of Blackvale settled on her shoulders like a heavy cloak. After tea and a brief rest, Serafina explored her new apartments. In addition to the bedchamber, there was a private sitting room, a dressing room filled with new gowns she had not selected, and a luxurious bathing chamber. Everything spoke of wealth and consideration for comfort, if not personal warmth. Her attention was drawn to a portrait hanging in the sitting room, a beautiful woman with fair hair and solemn eyes, wearing a gown of deep green that complemented the black veil emerald on her finger. "The late Countess of Blackvale," came a voice from the doorway. Seraphina turned to find Mrs. Quicksilver had returned, a fresh jug of hot water in her hands. "The Earl's mother?" "Yes, my lady. Lady Isolde. God rest her soul." Seraphina studied the portrait more closely. There was something vaguely familiar about the woman's features, though she could not place why. "She died when his lordship was still quite young," Mrs. Quicksilver continued, setting down the water. "A terrible fever took both her and the old Earl within days of each other. The young master, that is his lordship, was but 17 when he inherited. So young to bear such responsibility," Seraphina murmured, despite herself. "Indeed, my lady. Changed him, it did." The housekeeper's eyes grew distant. "He was a different boy before, laughed more freely afterward." She seemed to catch herself, straightening her spine. "Forgive me, my lady. It is not my place to speak of the Earl's personal matters." Seraphina's curiosity piqued. "You have known him since childhood, then?" "Since he was born, my lady. I was lady's maid to his mother before becoming housekeeper." Mrs. Quicksilver's expression softened briefly. "If I may be so bold, my lady, it does the heart good to see a countess at Blackvale again. The house has been too long without a mistress's touch." Before Seraphina could respond, a clock chimed the hour. "Clara will be here shortly, my lady. I shall take my leave." Alone again, Seraphina returned to the portrait. The Countess Isolde's eyes seemed to follow her, assessing the new bearer of her title and jewels. Was there judgment in that gaze, or warning? Clara arrived precisely at 7, a slight girl with quick hands and nervous eyes. She helped Seraphina dress for dinner in a gown of sapphire silk that had mysteriously appeared in the wardrobe, perfectly sized for her figure. The Earl's foresight was both impressive and unsettling. The dining room at Blackvale House could have comfortably seated 30, yet only 2 places were set, at opposite ends of the gleaming mahogany table. The Earl was already present when Seraphina entered, rising from his chair with formal courtesy. "Countess," he inclined his head. "My lord." She took her seat as a footman held her chair. The first course was served in silence. Seraphina found herself studying her husband across the expanse of table, noting the rigid set of his shoulders, the taut line of his jaw. He was handsome in the conventional sense, well-formed features, strong profile, the kind of face that commanded respect in gentlemen's clubs and parliament chambers. Yet there was something closed about him, as though he existed behind glass. "I trust your chambers are satisfactory?" he asked, finally breaking the silence. "They are most comfortable, thank you." "Good." He took a sip of wine. "I have arranged for a modiste to visit tomorrow. You will need suitable attire for the season." "The season?" Seraphina set down her fork. "You intend to present me to society? You are the Countess of Blackvale. Your presence will be expected at certain functions. Even though I am the daughter of a disgraced baron." His grey eyes met hers directly. "You are my wife now. Your father's situation is no longer relevant to your social standing. How convenient that a simple ceremony can wash away years of scandal." "Nothing about scandal is ever simple, Countess." His tone held a warning edge. "But yes, my name will shield you from the worst of society's cruelty. Whether you can maintain that protection depends on your own conduct." The implied threat hung between them. Seraphina lifted her chin. "I am well versed in proper behavior, my lord. I was raised a baroness's daughter, after all." "So you were." Something flickered in his eyes, perhaps recognition of her backbone, or merely irritation at her defiance. "Our first engagement will be Lord and Lady Pembroke's ball next week. I suggest you use the time until then to familiarize yourself with the house and your duties as Countess." "And what exactly are those duties beyond appearing decorative at social functions?" The Earl regarded her for a long moment. "Blackvale has extensive charitable interests that have been neglected in the absence of a countess. The tenant farms require occasional visits. The household staff will look to you for direction regarding domestic matters." He paused. "And eventually, of course, there is the matter of an heir." Seraphina nearly choked on her wine. "I see, though that particular duty need not concern us immediately." The rest of the meal passed in stilted conversation about the estate and the approaching social season. Not once did the Earl mention her family's lands or her father's exoneration, the very purpose for which she had entered this marriage. Seraphina held her tongue, knowing that pressing the matter on their first night would achieve nothing. After dinner, the Earl excused himself to his study, leaving Seraphina to find her way back to her chambers alone. As she navigated the dimly lit corridors, She passed a partially open door that revealed a glimpse of shelves lined with books. The library. Drawn by curiosity and the promise of distraction, she entered. The room was vast, with floor-to-ceiling shelves interrupted only by tall windows and a massive fireplace where embers still glowed. Serafina trailed her fingers along leather-bound spines, breathing in the comforting scent of paper and binding glue. A portrait above the mantel caught her attention. The old Earl and his Countess, seated together with a solemn, dark-haired boy between them. Young Alaric, before grief and responsibility had hardened him. "The library is at your disposal, Countess." Serafina startled at the Earl's voice behind her. She had not heard him enter. "Forgive me. I was exploring." "No forgiveness necessary. It is your home now." The words sounded hollow, performative rather than welcoming. Serafina turned her attention back to the portrait. "You favor your father." "So I have been told." "Mrs. Quicksilver mentioned that you were quite young when they died." Something closed in his expression. "Mrs. Quicksilver speaks too freely." "She meant no harm. She seems to hold great affection for you. She is a loyal servant." The Earl moved to stand beside her, his gaze fixed on the portrait. "My parents died within a week of each other, a fever that swept through the house. Several servants also perished. I am sorry." He glanced at her, surprise evident in his face, as though her sympathy was unexpected. It was long ago, but not forgotten, Serafina thought, noting the tight set of his jaw, the way his hands clasped behind his back. This was a man who held himself under rigid control. "I shall retire," she said after a moment of weighted silence. "Good night, my lord." She was nearly to the door when his voice stopped her. "Countess." Serafina turned. "Yes? Tomorrow I shall show you the east wing of Thornvale Manor. We will ride out after breakfast." Her heart leapt. "Thornvale? So soon? Unless you prefer to wait." "No," she said quickly. "Tomorrow would be most agreeable." The faintest curve of his lips might have been a smile. "Until tomorrow, then. Sleep well, Countess." As Serafina made her way back to her chambers, she could not decide which unsettled her more: the prospect of returning to her childhood home as the wife of the man who now owned it, or the brief moment when the Earl had almost seemed human. Thornvale Manor appeared on the horizon like a spectre from the past, its weathered stone walls rising from mist-shrouded grounds. Serafina felt her breath catch as the Earl guided their horses up the long drive. 5 years had passed since she had last seen her childhood home, yet every detail remained etched in her memory. The stables where her father had taught her to ride, the lake where she had sailed paper boats, the oak tree where she had read countless books on summer afternoons. "Are you well, Countess?" The Earl's voice pulled her from her reverie. "Yes." She straightened in her saddle. "It is merely strange to return." He nodded, his expression unreadable. They rode in silence until they reached the manor house itself, where a solitary groom waited to take their horses. "The staff has been reduced since I acquired the property," the Earl explained as he assisted her in dismounting, his hands firm at her waist. "I visit rarely. Yet you kept it rather than selling it." Serafina could not keep the accusation from her voice. His grey eyes met hers. "It is a valuable estate. Is that all it is to you? An investment?" Something flickered across his face too quickly to interpret. "Come, the east wing awaits." The entrance hall was eerily familiar, though the furnishings had been draped in dust cloths, giving the impression of ghosts lurking beneath. Serafina ran her fingertips along the banister of the grand staircase, half expecting her mother to appear at the top, calling down a greeting. "This way." The Earl led her through a corridor, their footsteps echoing on the marble floor. The east wing had always belonged to the lady of the house. Generations of Thornvale women had maintained their private apartments there, separate from the more masculine domains of the estate. Serafina's mother had cherished these rooms, filling them with flowers and books and delicate treasures collected over a lifetime. The Earl unlocked a set of double doors and stepped back, allowing Serafina to enter first. Her heart constricted at the sight. Nothing had changed. Her mother's favorite settee still stood by the window, though now covered in protective cloth. The writing desk, where she had composed countless letters, remained in its place. Even the paintings on the walls, pastoral scenes her mother had adored, hung undisturbed. "You kept it as it was," Serafina whispered. "I had no use for these rooms." The Earl remained in the doorway, watching her. The furniture and personal items were inventoried but left in place. Serafina moved deeper into the suite, trailing her fingers over familiar surfaces. A porcelain figurine of a shepherdess, a silver-backed hairbrush on the dressing table, small totems of a life cut short. The adjoining rooms include your mother's bedchamber, dressing room, and a small library, the Earl continued, his tone businesslike. The keys are here. He placed a ring on a side table. You may visit whenever you wish. A carriage will be at your disposal. Serafina turned to face him, struggling to reconcile this unexpected consideration with her image of the cold, calculating man who had destroyed her family. Why? She asked finally. Why what, Countess? Why preserve these rooms? Why allow me access now? It was not part of our arrangement. The Earl clasped his hands behind his back, a habit she had noticed when he was uncomfortable. I am not entirely without compassion, despite what you may believe. Compassion? Serafina's voice sharpened. Was it compassion that led you to testify against my father, to claim these lands that had belonged to my family for generations? His expression hardened. Your father was found guilty by a court of law, not by my testimony alone. A court influenced by powerful men with grudges and ambitions. You would do well to guard such opinions, Countess. They border on sedition. And you would do well to remember that I married you for the restoration of my family's honor, not for the privilege of visiting my mother's rooms like a guest in my own home. They stood facing each other, tension crackling between them like heat lightning. Serafina's chest rose and fell rapidly with suppressed emotion, while the Earl's jaw clenched so tightly a muscle twitched beneath his skin. The papers for your lands will be transferred as agreed, he said finally, his voice carefully controlled. As for your father's exoneration, the process has begun, but these matters take time, and in the meantime, I am to play the grateful bride, to smile at society functions and pretend I do not despise the very ground you walk upon? Something flashed in his eyes. Anger, certainly, but perhaps also hurt. The notion was so unexpected that Serafina faltered. Our arrangement is a contract, not a romance, he said coldly. Your feelings toward me are irrelevant so long as you fulfill your role as Countess. And if I cannot, if I find the charade too difficult to maintain, then you will lose everything. Again, he turned toward the door. Take as much time as you need here. I have business to attend to with the groundskeeper. The groom will show you to the stables when you are ready to return. He was gone before she could respond, his footsteps fading down the corridor. Serafina sank onto her mother's settee, anger and confusion warring within her. The Earl was not what she had expected, crueler in some ways, yet unexpectedly considerate in others. She had prepared herself for a tyrant, not this complex, contradictory man who preserved her mother's rooms while refusing to acknowledge any wrongdoing in her father's case. A shaft of sunlight cut through the window, illuminating dust motes dancing in the air. Serafina rose and began to explore more thoroughly, drawing back dust cloths to reveal familiar treasures. In her mother's bedchamber, she found the jewelry box still containing the lesser pieces that had not been sold to support Serafina after her parents' deaths. The small library yielded greater treasures, her mother's collection of poetry, her father's treatises on agriculture, even Serafina's own childhood books. She pulled one from the shelf, a volume of fairy tales with hand-colored illustrations, and opened it to find her own childish signature on the flyleaf. As she replaced the book, her eye caught something unusual, a section of the bookshelf that protruded slightly. Curious, she pressed against it, and to her surprise, the panel swung open to reveal a small hidden compartment. Inside lay a leather-bound journal she had never seen before. Her father's handwriting filled the pages, entries dated from the months before his arrest. Serafina sank into a chair, heart pounding as she began to read. Most entries concerned estate matters, but as she read further, she found references to meetings with the old Earl of Blackvale and concerns about a third party, identified only as G. March 15, 1809, met with B again regarding the troubling rumors. He shares my suspicions about G.S. involvement in the missing shipments. We must proceed with caution. The evidence remains circumstantial. April 2, 1809, B has fallen ill suddenly. His son delivered a message cancelling our meeting. Most inconvenient timing, as G presses for answers about the colonial investments. April 10, 1809, terrible news. B has died, along with his countess. The fever took them both within days. Young Alaric is devastated. All our plans must be set aside while the estate transitions. I fear G will use this opportunity to his advantage. The final entry, dated just 3 days before her father's arrest, sent a chill down Serafina's spine. April 30th, 1809. Evidence has been planted. I am certain of it. Papers missing from my study have reappeared with alterations. G means to implicate me in treason, but to what end? I have written to young Blackvale, but he refuses to see me. He believes I betrayed his father somehow. G.S. poison has already taken root. I must secure these notes where they cannot be found. If anything happens to me, let it be known that Lord Grimshaw is not what he seems. Lord Grimshaw. The name was vaguely familiar, a peer who had occasionally visited Thornvale during her childhood, a friend of her father's, she had thought, though these entries suggested otherwise, and the old Earl of Blackvale, not an enemy as she had always believed, but an ally. Her father had been meeting with him, sharing concerns about this mysterious Grimshaw. If her father's suspicions were correct, Grimshaw had somehow framed him for treason, perhaps after eliminating the old Earl who might have defended him. But why would the current Earl have testified against her father if the sound of approaching footsteps startled her? Quickly, Seraphina slipped the journal into her riding coat's inner pocket and closed the hidden compartment just as the Earl appeared in the doorway. "The skies are darkening," he said, seemingly unaware of her discovery. "We should return to Blackvale before the rain begins." Seraphina nodded, hoping her face did not betray her agitation. Yes, of course. As they rode back, the journal pressed against her side like a burning coal. Questions tumbled through her mind. Had the young Earl knowingly condemned an innocent man? Or had he too been deceived by this Grimshaw? And if her father was indeed innocent, what did that mean for her marriage? A union built on the foundation of reclaiming what was wrongfully taken. The first drops of rain began to fall as they reached the halfway point between the estates. What had been a light shower suddenly intensified, driven by gusting wind. "There's a gamekeeper's cottage ahead," the Earl shouted over the downpour. "We'll shelter there until it passes." They urged their horses forward, arriving at a small stone building nestled among trees. The Earl dismounted quickly, tying their horses beneath a sheltering oak before helping Seraphina down. They hurried inside, both already soaked to the skin. The cottage was simple but clean, clearly maintained for occasional use. A small fireplace dominated one wall, with a narrow bed and table comprising the main furnishings. "Fortunate that the gamekeeper keeps kindling ready," the Earl remarked, kneeling to start a fire. His wet coat had been discarded over a chair, his white shirt clinging to the broad planes of his back as he worked. Seraphina stood awkwardly by the door, water dripping from her riding habit. The journal felt heavier than ever in her pocket, its secrets burning to be confronted. "You should remove your coat," the Earl said, glancing back at her as flames began to catch. "You'll catch a chill otherwise." Reluctantly, Seraphina shed her outer garment, careful to first slip the journal into the folds of her skirt. She moved closer to the growing fire, grateful for its warmth, but acutely aware of the Earl's proximity in the small space. "It appears we may be here some time," he observed, moving to the window where rain lashed against the glass. The storm has settled in. An uncomfortable silence fell between them. Seraphina stared into the flames, debating whether to confront him with her discovery. Without the full context, without knowing whether he had been complicit or merely deceived, such a confrontation could be dangerous. "Something troubles you, Countess." It was not a question. Seraphina looked up, startled by his perception. The firelight cast his features in sharp relief, shadows emphasizing the strong line of his jaw, the intensity of his grey eyes. "Many things trouble me, my lord. My situation is not one I would have chosen. Yet you accepted my proposal readily enough. I had little choice, you saw to that." His expression tightened. "I offered a solution to your circumstances, one that benefited us both." "Did it? Benefit us both?" Seraphina took a step toward him, caution momentarily forgotten. "Or did you merely seek to assuage your conscience by making some small restitution for the injustice done to my family?" The Earl's eyes narrowed. "What precisely are you implying, Countess?" The journal seemed to burn against her leg. "Tell him," a voice urged within her. "Demand answers." But another voice counseled caution. If the Earl had been involved in her father's downfall, revealing her knowledge too soon could be disastrous. "I imply nothing," she said finally. "I merely observe that our marriage serves your interests more than mine. A disgraced baron's daughter lends you no social advantage, while your name and fortune rescue me from obscurity. The exchange seems uneven." He studied her for a long moment, as though sensing the unspoken accusation beneath her words. "Perhaps my motives are not as transparent as you believe." "Few things are, my lord." Seraphina turned back to the fire. "Least of all, the truth." Chapter 5. Divided Hearts. The rain continued unabated, drumming against the cottage roof with increasing intensity. Through the small window, Serafina watched darkness descend prematurely as storm clouds blotted out the afternoon sun. They would not be returning to Blackvale House any time soon. "We may need to reconcile ourselves to spending the night," the Earl said, echoing her thoughts. He had moved to the small cupboard in the corner, examining its contents. "There is some tea and preserved food. The gamekeeper keeps basic provisions." Serafina nodded, acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation. Alone with her husband in a remote cottage was perfectly acceptable in principle. They were married, after all, but the reality of such intimate proximity to a man she scarcely knew sent a flutter of apprehension through her. "Are you cold still?" he asked, noticing her slight shiver. "No, the fire is quite sufficient." He studied her face, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "This is not how I intended your first visit to Thornvale to unfold. Life seldom unfolds according to intention." Serafina seated herself on a wooden chair near the fire, careful to arrange her skirt so the hidden journal would not be visible. "Tell me, my lord, why did you truly preserve my mother's rooms as they were?" The Earl busied himself with preparing tea, his back to her. "I told you, I had no use for them. You could have repurposed them, sold the furnishings, there was value there. Would you have preferred that?" A sharp edge had entered his voice. "No, but it would have been more in keeping with the man I believed you to be." He turned to face her, his expression guarded. "And what sort of man is that? Calculating, cold, someone who seizes advantage without sentiment or regret." His jaw tightened, but he did not deny the characterization. "How you have constructed quite the villain in your mind, Countess. You gave me ample material to work with." A flicker of something, regret perhaps, crossed his features before the mask of indifference returned. He handed her a cup of tea, the delicate porcelain incongruous in his large hands. "Your father was found guilty of selling state secrets to Napoleon's agents," he said after a moment. "The evidence was compelling. Documents in his own hand, witness testimony, money traced to French sources, fabricated evidence," Serafina countered, thinking of her father's journal. "Or so my father believed." The Earl's grey eyes sharpened. "What do you mean?" Serafina hesitated. She had revealed too much in her anger. "It is what any innocent man would believe," she said carefully. "That evidence against him must be fabricated." He studied her with unsettling intensity, as though trying to read the thoughts behind her words. "You seem very certain of his innocence for someone who was barely 16 when he was tried. I knew my father. He was a patriot, not a traitor." The Earl said nothing, but his expression suggested he was not convinced. They lapsed into silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the relentless rain. Serafina sipped her tea, mind racing. The journal in her skirts felt like a ticking bomb, its revelations potentially explosive. If her father's suspicions were correct, this man across from her had been manipulated into condemning an innocent. But by whom? The mysterious Lord Grimshaw mentioned in the journal. "Have you ever met Lord Grimshaw?" she asked suddenly. The Earl looked up, surprise evident in his face. "Mordecai Grimshaw? Of course. He was a close associate of my father's." His eyes narrowed. "Why do you ask?" "He visited Thornvale occasionally when I was a child. I was merely reminiscing. He remains a frequent visitor at Blackvale. In fact, he's expected next week. You shall meet him again at the Pembroke Ball." Serafina felt a chill that had nothing to do with her damp clothes. The man her father suspected of framing him, of possibly causing the death of the Earl's parents, was a regular guest at Blackvale House. Did the Earl not suspect, or was he somehow complicit? "You seem troubled by the prospect," the Earl observed, watching her closely. "Not at all. It will be interesting to renew the acquaintance." Lightning flashed, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Serafina started, nearly spilling her tea. The storm was directly overhead now. "We are safe here," the Earl assured her, misinterpreting her alarm. "The cottage has weathered many such storms." He moved to add more wood to the fire, then stood looking down at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "You should rest," he said finally. "Take the bed. I'll make do with the chair." "I couldn't possibly—" "You could and you will." His tone brooked no argument. "Your health is of concern to me, if only because a sick countess cannot fulfill her social obligations." Always practical, even in his moments of consideration, Serafina concealed her irritation. "Very well, but I am not tired yet." The Earl nodded and took the seat opposite her. For a time they sat in uncomfortable silence, the fire casting dancing shadows across the small room. "Tell me of your plans for the Thornvale lands," he said finally, "the portion being returned to you." Seraphina had given this considerable thought since accepting his proposal. "I intend to restore the tenant farms. Many families were displaced when I took possession," he finished when she hesitated. "Yes, some had farmed that land for generations. I would see them returned if they wish it." The Earl nodded. "A commendable goal. The current tenants could be relocated to other Blackvale holdings." Seraphina blinked, surprised by his ready accommodation. "You would do that?" "It seems the fair course." He paused. "You will need a capable steward. I could recommend several." "That would be helpful. Thank you." His lips quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "You seem surprised by my cooperation, Countess." "I am," she admitted. "It does not align with my expectations." "Perhaps your expectations require adjustment." She studied him in the firelight, trying to reconcile this reasonable man with the cold-eyed youth who had testified against her father, sending him to prison and eventual death. Could he truly have been deceived? Or was this merely another facet of a complex deception? The journal might hold more answers. "If you'll excuse me, my lord, I find I am fatigued after all." He rose immediately. "Of course, I shall step outside for a moment to check on the horses, to give you privacy." The consideration surprised her again. "Thank you." When he had gone, Seraphina quickly moved to the small bed, pulling the journal from her skirts. There was no time to read more now. He would return shortly, but she needed to secure it somewhere less conspicuous than her clothing. She slipped it beneath the thin mattress, ensuring it was not visible, then quickly arranged herself on the bed, pulling a coarse blanket over her still damp dress. The Earl returned a few minutes later, rainwater dripping from his greatcoat. "The horses are secure," he reported, hanging the coat near the fire, though thoroughly displeased with their accommodations. "As are we all," Seraphina murmured, attempting levity. He glanced at her, something like amusement in his eyes. "Hardly the luxury to which the Countess of Blackvale is entitled, I agree. I was not always the Countess of Blackvale." She pulled the blanket closer. "I have known simpler circumstances." "Yes." His expression sobered. "I am aware." An awkward silence fell between them. Seraphina closed her eyes, feigning drowsiness to avoid further conversation. The journal's revelations swirled in her mind, making real rest impossible. She must have dozed despite her racing thoughts, for she woke with a start some time later. The cottage was dark, save for the dying fire's glow. Rain still pattered against the roof, though with less violence than before. The Earl sat in a chair by the fire, his head tilted back, eyes closed. In sleep, the stern lines of his face softened, making him appear younger, more vulnerable. Seraphina found herself studying him with curiosity rather than animosity. What had it been like for him, she wondered, to lose both parents so suddenly, to inherit an earldom at 17? Had he truly believed her father guilty, or had he been manipulated in his grief by this Lord Grimshaw? As if sensing her scrutiny, the Earl's eyes opened. For a moment he seemed disoriented, then his gaze focused on her. "You should return to sleep," he said, his voice rough with drowsiness. "I cannot." Seraphina sat up. "My mind is too active." He nodded, understanding in his expression. "A common affliction. Do you suffer from it as well?" "Frequently." He stoked the fire, adding another log. "Particularly when matters of business are unsettled. Is that how you view our marriage? As a business matter?" He glanced at her, firelight reflecting in his grey eyes. "Is that not how you view it?" "I asked first, my lord." A faint smile curved his lips. "So you did." He considered for a moment. "Our marriage is a contract, certainly. A means to mutual advantage, but—" He hesitated. "I would not have it be merely that." Seraphina's heart quickened unexpectedly. "What would you have it be?" "A partnership at minimum. Perhaps in time, a friendship." "Friendship requires trust, my lord." "Indeed it does." His eyes held hers. "Trust must be earned, I suppose." "Yes." She thought of the journal hidden beneath her. "It must." The Earl rose and moved to the window, looking out at the rain-drenched night. "The storm has lessened. We should be able to return to Blackvale at first light." Seraphina nodded, though he could not see the gesture with his back turned. She studied the broad set of his shoulders, the proud line of his spine. A young man forced too early into responsibility, who had perhaps made grievous errors in judgment, or a calculating deceiver playing a long game she did not yet understand. "My lord," she said suddenly, decision made, "there is something I must ask you." He turned, brows raised in inquiry. "Yes? Did you believe the evidence against my father? Truly believe it? Or did you simply wish to believe it? The question seemed to catch him off guard. His expression shifted, guard momentarily lowered. I believed what I was shown, he said finally. Documents in your father's hand, testimony from trusted sources, including Lord Grimshaw? His eyes narrowed slightly. Yes, he provided key evidence of your father's meetings with French agents. And you never questioned it, even knowing my father was your own father's friend and associate. A muscle twitched in his jaw. They had a falling out shortly before my father's death. Grimshaw informed me of certain accusations my father had made against yours. What sort of accusations? That your father had been embezzling from their joint ventures. That he had used their friendship to gain access to sensitive information. The Earl frowned. Why this sudden interrogation, Countess? Serafina hesitated. Should she reveal the journal now, without having read it fully, without understanding all its implications? I merely seek to understand the man I have married, she said finally. The man who destroyed my family, yet now offers partial restoration. Something flashed in his eyes. Anger, certainly, but perhaps also doubt. Your father's actions destroyed your family, Countess, not mine. And if you were wrong, if the evidence was fabricated, then— He stopped, his expression troubled. That would be impossible to reconcile. Would it? Would you admit such an error? Make true restitution? The Earl's face hardened. This line of questioning serves no purpose, Countess. The matter was settled by the courts years ago. Courts can be misled. Men can be deceived. Serafina rose from the bed, facing him directly. Especially grieving young men seeking someone to blame for their parents' deaths. His eyes widened fractionally. What are you suggesting? Before she could respond, a sudden gust of wind rattled the cottage door. The Earl turned toward the sound, the moment broken. We should try to rest, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Morning will be here soon enough. Serafina recognized the dismissal for what it was. She had pushed too far, revealed too much of her suspicions. Nodding, she returned to the bed, mind racing with new questions. The Earl had been fed evidence against her father by Lord Grimshaw, the very man her father suspected of framing him, and there had been a supposed falling out between her father and the old Earl, again according to Grimshaw. Were these fabrications as well? She needed to read the rest of the journal, needed to understand what her father had uncovered before his arrest. Only then could she determine whether her husband was victim or villain in this complex web of deception. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the rain and the Earl's measured breathing from his chair, Serafina made a decision. She would accept Lord Grimshaw's reacquaintance at the Pembroke ball with all apparent grace, would observe him, assess him, perhaps even charm him into revealing something useful, and she would watch her husband carefully for signs of complicity or ignorance. For now the Earl of Blackvale remained an enigma, the man she had sworn to hate, yet found herself increasingly unable to dismiss as the simple villain of her narrative. There were layers to him she had not anticipated, complexities she was only beginning to glimpse. Whether those complexities concealed redemption or deeper treachery remained to be seen. The rain continued unabated, drumming against the cottage roof with increasing intensity. Through the small window, Serafina watched darkness descend prematurely as storm clouds blotted out the afternoon sun. They would not be returning to Blackvale House any time soon. We may need to reconcile ourselves to spending the night, the Earl said, echoing her thoughts. He had moved to the small cupboard in the corner, examining its contents. There is some tea and preserved food. The gamekeeper keeps basic provisions. Serafina nodded, acutely aware of the impropriety of their situation. Alone with her husband in a remote cottage was perfectly acceptable in principle. They were married after all. But the reality of such intimate proximity to a man she scarcely knew sent a flutter of apprehension through her. "Are you cold still?" he asked, noticing her slight shiver. "No, the fire is quite sufficient." He studied her face, his expression softening almost imperceptibly. "This is not how I intended your first visit to Thornvale to unfold. Life seldom unfolds according to intention." Serafina seated herself on a wooden chair near the fire, careful to arrange her skirts so the hidden journal would not be visible. "Tell me, my lord, why did you truly preserve my mother's rooms as they were?" The Earl busied himself with preparing tea, his back to her. "I told you I had no use for them. You could have repurposed them, sold the furnishings. There was value there. Would you have preferred that?" A sharp edge had entered his voice. "No, but it would have been more in keeping with the man I believed you to be." He turned to face her, his expression guarded. "And what sort of man is that? Calculating, cold, someone who seizes advantage without sentiment or regret." His jaw tightened. But he did not deny the characterization. "You have constructed quite the villain in your mind, Countess. You gave me ample material to work with." A flicker of something, regret perhaps, crossed his features before the mask of indifference returned. He handed her a cup of tea, the delicate porcelain incongruous in his large hands. "Your father was found guilty of selling state secrets to Napoleon's agents," he said after a moment. "The evidence was compelling. Documents in his own hand, witness testimony, money traced to French sources. Fabricated evidence," Serafina countered, thinking of her father's journal. "Or so my father believed." The Earl's grey eyes sharpened. "What do you mean?" Serafina hesitated. She had revealed too much in her anger. "It is what any innocent man would believe," she said carefully. "That evidence against him must be fabricated." He studied her with unsettling intensity, as though trying to read the thoughts behind her words. "You seem very certain of his innocence for someone who was barely 16 when he was tried." "I knew my father. He was a patriot, not a traitor." The Earl said nothing, but his expression suggested he was not convinced. They lapsed into silence, the only sounds the crackling fire and the relentless rain. Serafina sipped her tea, mind racing. The journal in her skirts felt like a ticking bomb, its revelations potentially explosive. If her father's suspicions were correct, this man across from her had been manipulated into condemning an innocent. But by whom? The mysterious Lord Grimshaw mentioned in the journal. "Have you ever met Lord Grimshaw?" she asked suddenly. The Earl looked up, surprise evident in his face. "Mordecai Grimshaw? Of course. He was a close associate of my father's." His eyes narrowed. "Why do you ask?" "He visited Thornvale occasionally when I was a child. I was merely reminiscing. He remains a frequent visitor at Blackvale. In fact, he's expected next week. You shall meet him again at the Pembroke Ball." Serafina felt a chill that had nothing to do with her damp clothes. The man her father suspected of framing him, of possibly causing the death of the Earl's parents, was a regular guest at Blackvale House. Did the Earl not suspect, or was he somehow complicit? "You seem troubled by the prospect," the Earl observed, watching her closely. "Not at all. It will be interesting to renew the acquaintance." Lightning flashed, followed almost immediately by a deafening crack of thunder. Serafina started, nearly spilling her tea. The storm was directly overhead now. "We are safe here," the Earl assured her, misinterpreting her alarm. "The cottage has weathered many such storms." He moved to add more wood to the fire, then stood looking down at her, his expression unreadable in the flickering light. "You should rest," he said finally. "Take the bed. I'll make do with the chair." "I couldn't possibly—" "You could and you will." His tone brooked no argument. "Your health is of concern to me, if only because a sick countess cannot fulfill her social obligations." Always practical, even in his moments of consideration. Serafina concealed her irritation. "Very well, but I am not tired yet." The Earl nodded and took the seat opposite her. For a time they sat in uncomfortable silence, the fire casting dancing shadows across the small room. "Tell me of your plans for the Thornvale lands," he said finally, "the portion being returned to you." Serafina had given this considerable thought since accepting his proposal. "I intend to restore the tenant farms. Many families were displaced when I took possession," he finished when she hesitated. "Yes, some had farmed that land for generations. I would see them returned if they wish it." The Earl nodded. "A commendable goal. The current tenants could be relocated to other Blackvale holdings." Serafina blinked, surprised by his ready accommodation. "You would do that?" "It seems the fair course." He paused. "You will need a capable steward. I could recommend several." "That would be helpful, thank you." His lips quirked in what might have been the ghost of a smile. "You seem surprised by my cooperation, Countess." "I am," she admitted. "It does not align with my expectations. Perhaps your expectations require adjustment." She studied him in the firelight, trying to reconcile this reasonable man with the cold-eyed youth who had testified against her father, sending him to prison and eventual death. Could he truly have been deceived, or was this merely another facet of a complex deception? The journal might hold more answers. "If you'll excuse me, my lord, I find I am fatigued after all." He rose immediately. "Of course, I shall step outside for a moment to check on the horses, to give you privacy." The consideration surprised her again. "Thank you." When he had gone, Serafina quickly moved to the small bed, pulling the journal from her skirts. There was no time to read more now. He would return shortly, but she needed to secure it somewhere less conspicuous than her clothing. She slipped it beneath the thin mattress, ensuring it was not visible, then quickly arranged herself on the bed, pulling a coarse blanket over her still damp dress. The Earl returned a few minutes later, rainwater dripping from his greatcoat. "The horses are secure," he reported, hanging the coat near the fire, though thoroughly displeased with their accommodations. "As are we all," Serafina murmured, attempting levity. He glanced at her, something like amusement in his eyes. "Hardly the luxury to which the Countess of Blackvale is entitled. I agree. I was not always the Countess of Blackvale." She pulled the blanket closer. "I have known simpler circumstances." "Yes." His expression sobered. "I am aware." An awkward silence fell between them. Serafina closed her eyes, feigning drowsiness to avoid further conversation. The journal's revelations swirled in her mind, making real rest impossible. She must have dozed despite her racing thoughts, for she woke with a start some time later. The cottage was dark, save for the dying fire's glow. Rain still pattered against the roof, though with less violence than before. The Earl sat in a chair by the fire, his head tilted back, eyes closed. In sleep, the stern lines of his face softened, making him appear younger, more vulnerable. Serafina found herself studying him with curiosity rather than animosity. What had it been like for him, she wondered, to lose both parents so suddenly, to inherit an earldom at 17? Had he truly believed her father guilty, or had he been manipulated in his grief by this Lord Grimshaw? As if sensing her scrutiny, the Earl's eyes opened. For a moment, he seemed disoriented, then his gaze focused on her. "You should return to sleep," he said, his voice rough with drowsiness. "I cannot." Serafina sat up. "My mind is too active." He nodded, understanding in his expression. "A common affliction. Do you suffer from it as well?" "Frequently." He stoked the fire, adding another log. "Particularly when matters of business are unsettled. Is that how you view our marriage? As a business matter?" He glanced at her, firelight reflecting in his grey eyes. "Is that not how you view it?" "I asked first, my lord." A faint smile curved his lips. "So you did." He considered for a moment. "Our marriage is a contract, certainly, a means to mutual advantage, but—" he hesitated. "I would not have it be merely that." Serafina's heart quickened unexpectedly. "What would you have it be? A partnership at minimum, perhaps in time a friendship." "Friendship requires trust, my lord." "Indeed it does." His eyes held hers. "Trust must be earned, I suppose." "Yes." She thought of the journal hidden beneath her. "It must." The Earl rose and moved to the window, looking out at the rain-drenched night. "The storm has lessened. We should be able to return to Blackvale at first light." Serafina nodded, though he could not see the gesture with his back turned. She studied the broad set of his shoulders, the proud line of his spine. A young man forced too early into responsibility, who had perhaps made grievous errors in judgment, or a calculating deceiver playing a long game she did not yet understand. "My lord," she said suddenly, decision made, "there is something I must ask you." He turned, brows raised in inquiry. "Yes? Did you believe the evidence against my father? Truly believe it? Or did you simply wish to believe it?" The question seemed to catch him off guard. His expression shifted, guard momentarily lowered. "I believed what I was shown," he said finally. "Documents in your father's hand, testimony from trusted sources, including Lord Grimshaw?" His eyes narrowed slightly. "Yes, he provided key evidence of your father's meetings with French agents, and you never questioned it. Even knowing my father was your own father's friend and associate." A muscle twitched in his jaw. "They had a falling out shortly before my father's death. Grimshaw informed me of certain accusations my father had made against yours." "What sort of accusations?" "That your father had been embezzling from their joint ventures, that he had used their friendship to gain access to sensitive information." The Earl frowned. "Why this sudden interrogation, Countess?" Serafina hesitated. Should she reveal the journal now, without having read it fully, without understanding all its implications? "I merely seek to understand the man I have married," she said finally. "The man who destroyed my family, yet now offers partial restoration." Something flashed in his eyes. Anger, certainly, but perhaps also doubt. "Your father's actions destroyed your family, Countess, not mine. And if you were wrong, if the evidence was fabricated, then—" He stopped, his expression troubled. "That would be impossible to reconcile." "Would it? Would you admit such an error? Make true restitution?" The Earl's face hardened. "This line of questioning serves no purpose, Countess. The matter was settled by the courts years ago." Courts can be misled. Men can be deceived. Serafina rose from the bed, facing him directly. Especially grieving young men seeking someone to blame for their parents' deaths. His eyes widened fractionally. What are you suggesting? Before she could respond, a sudden gust of wind rattled the cottage door. The Earl turned toward the sound, the moment broken. We should try to rest, he said, his voice carefully controlled. Morning will be here soon enough. Serafina recognized the dismissal for what it was. She had pushed too far, revealed too much of her suspicions. Nodding, she returned to the bed, mind racing with new questions. The Earl had been fed evidence against her father by Lord Grimshaw, the very man her father suspected of framing him, and there had been a supposed falling out between her father and the old Earl, again according to Grimshaw. Were these fabrications as well? She needed to read the rest of the journal, needed to understand what her father had uncovered before his arrest. Only then could she determine whether her husband was victim or villain in this complex web of deception. As she lay in the darkness, listening to the rain and the Earl's measured breathing from his chair, Serafina made a decision. She would accept Lord Grimshaw's reacquaintance at the Pembroke ball with all apparent grace, would observe him, assess him, perhaps even charm him into revealing something useful, and she would watch her husband carefully for signs of complicity or ignorance. For now, the Earl of Blackvale remained an enigma, the man she had sworn to hate, yet found herself increasingly unable to dismiss as the simple villain of her narrative. There were layers to him she had not anticipated, complexities she was only beginning to glimpse. Whether those complexities concealed redemption or deeper treachery remained to be seen. The Pembroke ballroom glittered with candlelight, reflecting off jewels and polished silver as London's elite mingled in their finery. Serafina stood at the entrance, the Earl's hand resting lightly at the small of her back, a proprietary gesture that sent an unwelcome shiver along her spine. Countess Blackvale, the majordomo announced, his voice carrying over the hum of conversation and the strains of the orchestra. Heads turned. Whispers rippled through the crowd. Serafina felt the weight of curious stares as she descended the marble staircase on her husband's arm. She had anticipated scrutiny, but the reality was more daunting than expected. Smile, the Earl murmured, his lips barely moving. They scent weakness like hounds. Serafina lifted her chin, arranging her features into what she hoped was an expression of serene confidence. The blue silk gown, one of many her husband had commissioned, rustled softly with each step, its exquisite craftsmanship announcing the wearer's newfound status more effectively than any introduction. Lady Pembroke, a plump woman with shrewd eyes, greeted them with exaggerated delight. "My dear Earl, how wonderful you could attend, and this must be your new countess." Her gaze swept over Serafina, assessing and calculating. "What a charming match. Though I confess the news of your marriage came as quite the surprise." "The heart does not always announce its intentions to society first, Lady Pembroke," the Earl replied smoothly. The heart had precious little to do with it, Serafina thought, but she maintained her smile. "Your home is magnificent, Lady Pembroke. Thank you for including me in your invitation. But of course, my dear, we are all so eager to become acquainted with the new Countess of Blackvale." Lady Pembroke's smile didn't reach her eyes, particularly given your interesting background. The Earl's hand tightened at Serafina's waist. "My wife's lineage includes 3 dukes and a royal connection through her maternal grandmother. Quite impressive, as I'm sure you're aware." Lady Pembroke's smile faltered slightly. "Indeed, most impressive." She turned to greet another arriving couple, effectively dismissing them. As they moved into the ballroom, Serafina glanced at her husband. "Thank you for that small deception. My maternal grandmother was a vicar's daughter, as you well know. It wasn't entirely a deception. The vicar's wife was rumored to be the natural daughter of the Duke of Harwick, a distant royal connection, but technically accurate." Serafina raised an eyebrow. "You investigated my family history?" "I investigate everything that concerns me, Countess." His grey eyes met hers briefly. "Remember, tonight we present a united front. Your reception by society depends upon it." "How fortunate that I excel at pretense," she replied, her smile firmly in place as they were approached by an elderly couple. For the next hour, Serafina navigated a sea of introductions, memorizing names and connections, responding to thinly veiled curiosity with practiced grace. The Earl remained close, his hand occasionally brushing hers, his presence both reassuring and unsettling. She was midway through a conversation with a baroness when she felt the Earl stiffen beside her. Following his gaze, she saw a distinguished gentleman approaching. tall and silver-haired with a patrician face and the confident bearing of one accustomed to deference. Lord Mordecai Grimshaw. Seraphina's heart quickened. This was the man her father had implicated in his journal, the puppet master, who had potentially orchestrated his ruin and perhaps even the deaths of the Earl's parents. Blackvale, Grimshaw greeted, clasping the Earl's hand. Splendid to see you. Lady Pembroke mentioned you had taken a bride. His pale blue eyes settled on Seraphina, recognition dawning. My word. Isn't this Baron Thornvale's daughter? Countess Blackvale, the Earl corrected smoothly. My wife. Grimshaw's surprise appeared genuine. Indeed. How unexpected. He recovered quickly, taking Seraphina's gloved hand and bowing over it. A pleasure to renew our acquaintance, Countess. I recall visiting Thornvale Manor when you were but a child. Lord Grimshaw. Seraphina forced warmth into her voice. Yes, I remember your visits quite well. Such a tragedy. Your father's situation. Grimshaw's expression conveyed practiced sympathy. A brilliant man, led astray by unfortunate influences. I tried to counsel him, before the end. Seraphina felt the Earl's hand at her back again, a warning pressure. How kind of you to have taken an interest, she replied, careful to keep any hint of irony from her tone. Grimshaw has always been generous with his counsel, the Earl said, his voice neutral, a valued friend to both our families. Indeed, I have tried to be. Grimshaw's smile didn't reach his eyes. Speaking of counsel, Blackvale, I must discuss that shipping matter with you, perhaps tomorrow at my club. Unfortunately, I have commitments tomorrow. My steward arrives from the country estate. Ah, of course. Another time. Grimshaw turned to Seraphina. I hope you'll save a dance for an old family friend, Countess. Before she could respond, the Earl interjected. My wife's dance card is quite full this evening, I'm afraid. Perhaps at the next gathering. Grimshaw's smile tightened almost imperceptibly. Of course, another time then. With a bow, he moved away, immediately engaging a nearby diplomat in conversation. You were rather abrupt with him, Seraphina murmured, once Grimshaw was out of earshot. You seemed uncomfortable, the Earl replied, surprising her. Was I mistaken? No, she admitted. There is something disconcerting about him. The Earl's gaze followed Grimshaw across the room. He can be overwhelming to those unaccustomed to his manner. He has been a presence in my life since childhood, a mentor of sorts after my parents died. A mentor who, according to her father's journal, might have orchestrated those very deaths. Seraphina suppressed a shudder. The next dance is beginning, the Earl said, offering his hand. Shall we demonstrate for society that we are indeed a love match? Seraphina placed her hand in his, acutely aware of its warmth through her glove. Is that what we are pretending to be? I thought this was merely a business arrangement. Something flickered in his eyes. Tonight, we are whatever society expects us to be. The dance was a waltz, still considered daringly intimate in some circles. The Earl drew her into his arms with unexpected grace, maintaining a proper distance while guiding her smoothly across the floor. Seraphina was conscious of all the eyes upon them, judging, speculating, ready to detect any hint of discord. You dance well, Countess, he remarked as they executed a turn. My mother insisted upon proper instruction, even after, she hesitated, even after our circumstances changed. His expression softened slightly. She would be proud to see you now. Would she? Seraphina couldn't keep the edge from her voice. Her daughter married to the man who helped destroy her husband? The Earl's jaw tightened, but his steps never faltered. I believed I was serving justice. If I was wrong, he broke off. If you were wrong, she prompted. His grey eyes met hers, troubled beneath their usual reserve. Then, I have much to atone for. Before Seraphina could respond, a commotion near the entrance drew their attention. A young man had arrived, fashionably late and somewhat dishevelled, his handsome face flushed with what might have been exertion or drink. Ravenmore, the Earl muttered, his posture stiffening. I had hoped he wouldn't attend. Who is he? Seraphina asked, though she had already guessed from her husband's reaction. Viscount Thaddeus Ravenmore, Grimshaw's nephew and protégé, a charming wastrel with more ambition than sense. The Viscount was indeed charming, moving through the crowd with easy confidence, stopping to speak with Grimshaw before his gaze swept the room and locked on Seraphina. Something predatory entered his expression as he noted her proximity to the Earl. He's coming this way, Seraphina murmured as the dance ended. The Earl's hand settled possessively at her waist. Stay close. Ravenmore approached with a lazy smile and an exaggerated bow. Blackvale, you old fortress. Guarding your new treasure jealously, I see. His gaze raked over Seraphina with inappropriate thoroughness. Won't you introduce me to the mysterious bride who has all of London abuzz? Viscount Ravenmore, my wife, the Countess of Blackvale. The Earl's tone could have frosted glass. Countess Viscount Ravenmore, an acquaintance of Lord Grimshaw's. His nephew, actually. Ravenmore took Seraphina's hand, holding it longer than propriety dictated. The Countess is even lovelier than rumoured. Tell me, how did a confirmed bachelor like Blackvale persuade such a beauty to accept his suit? Perhaps by being something other than an impertinent boy, the Earl replied coldly. Ravenmore laughed, unperturbed by the insult. Always so serious, Blackvale. Life is for pleasure, is it not? Speaking of which, he turned to Seraphina with a conspiratorial smile. I believe the next dance is beginning, Countess. Might I have the honour? Before the Earl could intervene, Seraphina saw an opportunity. Ravenmore was Grimshaw's nephew, possibly privy to information that could help unravel the truth behind her father's disgrace. I would be delighted, my lord, she said, ignoring her husband's tightening grip on her waist. The Earl had no choice but to release her or create a scene. His expression was thunderous as Ravenmore led her toward the dance floor, but he maintained his composure, accepting Lady Pembroke's invitation to join her group near the refreshment table. Your husband appears displeased, Ravenmore remarked as they took their positions for the country dance. How delightful. Does he often glower so magnificently, or am I specially favoured? The Earl is protective, Seraphina replied carefully, as any husband might be. Protective or possessive? There's a difference, you know. Ravenmore executed a turn with surprising grace for someone rumoured to be in his cups. Everyone wonders how the daughter of a disgraced baron came to be Countess of Blackvale. Care to illuminate the mystery? I'm afraid it's terribly mundane. We met, we conversed, he proposed. And you accepted the man who helped send your father to prison? How very forgiving of you. Seraphina missed a step, quickly recovering. You seem well informed about my family history, my lord. My uncle keeps me apprised of all interesting developments in society. His smile didn't reach his eyes. He takes a particular interest in the Blackvale affairs. Lord Grimshaw has been a friend to the Earl since childhood, I understand. Oh yes, quite the mentor to young Alaric after the tragic death of his parents. Ravenmore's expression turned contemplative. Tell me, Countess, do you find it odd that your husband would marry the daughter of the man he helped condemn? Or was there perhaps some arrangement that made the match advantageous? The question was too pointed, too knowing. Seraphina maintained her serene expression with effort. I find nothing odd in a man choosing his own bride regardless of her circumstances. How diplomatic. But then, you must be diplomatic now that you're a countess. His hand at her waist pressed slightly closer than propriety allowed. Should you ever tire of diplomacy, or of the Earl's legendary coldness, you might find more warmth in other company. Seraphina stiffened. You forget yourself, my lord. On the contrary, I remember myself quite well. It is others who forget what they once were. His pale eyes, so similar to his uncle's, held a calculating gleam. For instance, a baron's daughter who once stood to inherit substantial properties before they were transferred to the Blackvale estate under questionable circumstances. The dance brought them momentarily apart before rejoining. When Ravenmore took her hand again, his voice lowered conspiratorially. What if I told you, Countess, that I have information about your father's case, documents that might shed new light on old allegations? Seraphina's heart quickened. What sort of documents? The sort that powerful men would prefer remained hidden. Ravenmore's smile was wolfish. The sort that might interest a daughter seeking to restore her father's name, or perhaps leverage a more favorable arrangement with her husband. Why would you share such information with me? Let's call it a mutual interest in historical accuracy. The dance ended, and he bowed over her hand. Consider my offer, Countess. I can be found at the Athenaeum most afternoons. A note would reach me there. Before she could respond, the Earl materialized at her side, his expression controlled but his eyes like winter ice. Thank you for entertaining my wife, Viscount. If you'll excuse us, Lady Harrington has requested an introduction. Ravenmore's smile was triumphant as he bowed. Of course, a pleasure, Countess. I look forward to our next meeting. As the Earl led her away, his grip on her arm was just short of painful. What did he say to you? He demanded in a low voice. Nothing of consequence, merely flirtation and impertinence. Ravenmore does nothing without purpose. He is Grimshaw's creature, deployed wherever his uncle needs eyes and ears. The Earl's jaw was tight. Stay away from him. Are you commanding me, my lord? I am warning you. His voice dropped further. Ravenmore is dangerous in ways you cannot anticipate. Something in his tone gave her pause. Not jealousy, she realized, but genuine concern. He mentioned having documents, she said carefully, regarding my father's case. The Earl stopped walking, drawing her into the shadow of a pillar. Whatever he offered is a trap, designed to compromise you or extract information. Do you understand? Why would he target me specifically? The Earl hesitated, conflict evident in his expression. There are complexities to your father's situation that I am still unraveling. Grimshaw has been making inquiries about certain papers rumored to be in your possession. Seraphina felt cold, despite the ballroom's warmth. The journal. They were seeking her father's journal. What papers? She asked, feigning ignorance. The Earl studied her face. That is what concerns me, I don't know. But Grimshaw's sudden interest in reconnecting with you, his dispatching Ravenmore to engage you, these are not coincidences. Perhaps they simply wish to assess whether I am a suitable countess for their friend and protégé. Perhaps, but his expression remained troubled. Nevertheless, exercise caution. Ravenmore particularly. The orchestra struck up another waltz. The Earl glanced toward the dance floor, then back at Seraphina, his expression softening imperceptibly. Would you honor me with this dance, Countess? To repair whatever damage Ravenmore may have inflicted on your evening. The gesture was unexpected, almost gentle. Seraphina placed her hand in his. I would like that, my lord. As they rejoined the dancers, Seraphina caught sight of Grimshaw and Ravenmore in close conversation, both watching her with calculating eyes. Whatever game they were playing, she was a piece on their board, but they did not realize she had begun to move according to her own strategy. The Earl drew her closer than before, his hand warm at her waist. So you have acquitted yourself admirably tonight, he murmured. Many would have faltered under such scrutiny. I was raised to maintain dignity regardless of circumstances. Yes, your mother's influence, I imagine. The mention of her mother, spoken with something like respect, caught Seraphina off guard. You knew her? I met her several times when visiting Thornvale with my father. She was a gracious hostess and a formidable intellect. You have her eyes. Seraphina had not expected this personal observation, this hint that he had noticed her as more than a contractual obligation. Thank you, she said simply. For a moment, as they turned in perfect synchronicity, it was possible to imagine that they were indeed what they pretended to be, a married couple sharing a dance, united by choice rather than necessity. His hand was steady at her waist, his steps sure, his grey eyes watchful, but no longer cold. Then Seraphina caught sight of Grimshaw again, his pale gaze following them, and reality reasserted itself. She was dancing with a man who might be her father's unwitting executioner or his deliberate destroyer, a man who now warned her against the very individuals who had shaped his own beliefs about her family. The music ended. The Earl released her with proper decorum, though his hand lingered at her waist a moment longer than necessary. I believe we have fulfilled our social obligations for the evening, he said. Unless you wish to remain. Seraphina shook her head. I would prefer to return home. The word felt strange on her lips, applied to Blackvale House. As their carriage rolled through London's dark streets, Seraphina contemplated the evening's revelations. Grimshaw and Ravenmore were seeking something, her father's journal most likely. The Earl seemed wary of them, yet maintained their friendship. And Ravenmore claimed to have documents that might shed light on her father's case. Could she trust any of them? The Earl's warning seemed genuine, but then he had his own interests to protect. If her father had been wrongfully convicted, the Earl's role in that conviction would require explanation, perhaps even restitution, beyond their current arrangement. You're very quiet, the Earl observed, as the carriage neared Blackvale House. I am tired. Society is more exhausting than teaching piano to merchants' daughters. A faint smile touched his lips. Indeed, though you navigated it with remarkable poise. Even while dancing with the disreputable Viscount Ravenmore, the smile vanished. Especially then, lesser women would have been flustered by his attentions. I am not easily flustered, my lord. His gaze was penetrating in the dimness of the carriage. No, you are not. It is one of your more admirable qualities. The unexpected compliment hung between them as the carriage stopped before Blackvale House. The Earl assisted her down, his hand steady beneath her elbow. As they entered the grand foyer, he surprised her by asking, Would you care for a brandy in the library? I find I am not yet ready for sleep. Seraphina hesitated, then nodded. Yes, I would like that. The library was warm, a fire already burning in the grate. The Earl poured 2 small brandies, handing one to Serafina before taking a seat opposite her, rather than behind his massive desk. "To a successful debut," he said, raising his glass slightly. Serafina sipped the brandy, feeling its warmth spread through her chest. Was it successful? I sensed more curiosity than acceptance. Curiosity is the first step to acceptance. You conducted yourself with dignity and grace. The rest will follow. He studied her over the rim of his glass. You did not allow Ravenmore to rattle you, which will already have raised your estimation in certain circles. You seem very concerned about his attention to me. The Earl's expression darkened. Ravenmore has a reputation with women, particularly vulnerable women. I am hardly vulnerable, my lord. I am the Countess of Blackvale. Yes. Something in his voice shifted, became almost gentle. But you are also a young woman who has lost much, who entered a marriage of convenience with a man she has every reason to despise. Ravenmore would see that as vulnerability to exploit. Serafina was struck by his perception, his acknowledgement of her difficult position. You understand more than you reveal, my lord. As do you, Countess. He set down his glass. Whatever Ravenmore offered you, documents, revelations, assistance, is poison wrapped in pretty paper. Do not accept it. Why would you warn me against someone who might help clear my father's name, unless you fear what such documents might reveal about your own role in his conviction? The Earl's expression tightened. My role is a matter of public record. I testified to what I believed was true. Believed, past tense? He hesitated, conflict evident in his face. There have been inconsistencies I have discovered since then, questions I cannot yet answer. But I do not trust Ravenmore to provide those answers honestly. Serafina leaned forward. What inconsistencies? If you have doubts about my father's guilt, I deserve to know. The Earl rose, moving to stand before the fire. It is not that simple. There are implications beyond your father's case, matters involving national security that cannot be discussed freely. Convenient, Serafina said bitterly. The same shield used to prevent my father from mounting a proper defense. He turned to face her, his expression troubled. I understand your frustration, but I ask you to trust that I am investigating these matters thoroughly. If your father was indeed wrongfully convicted, I will see justice done. Why? Why would you seek to overturn a conviction you helped secure? Because I value truth above pride. His voice was quiet but firm. And because I owe you that much at least. Serafina studied him, trying to reconcile this man, principled, troubled by doubt, warning her against those who claimed to offer help, with the cold-eyed youth who had testified against her father. If you truly wish to help, she said carefully, share what you know. What inconsistencies have you found? What doubts plague you? The Earl's hesitation was palpable. I cannot. Not yet. There are matters I must confirm first. Proof I must secure. So I am to simply wait and trust, while you decide what truths I am permitted to know about my own father? His expression hardened slightly. Would you prefer I shared half-formed suspicions? Accusations without evidence? That would make me no better than those who condemned your father in the first place. The logic was sound but frustrating. Serafina rose, setting down her barely touched brandy. I should retire. Thank you for the drink, and the warning about Viscount Ravenmore. The Earl nodded, making no move to stop her. Good night, Countess. At the door she paused, turning back to find his gaze still upon her. My lord, if you discover proof of my father's innocence, what then? What becomes of our arrangement? Something like regret crossed his features. I don't know, but whatever comes, I will honor the spirit of our agreement, if not its original terms. It was not the reassurance she had hoped for, but it was honest. Serafina nodded and left him standing before the fire, his tall figure casting a long shadow across the library floor. In her chambers, as Clara helped her out of the blue silk gown, Serafina's mind raced with the evening's revelations. The Earl suspected something amiss in her father's case, but would not share his concerns. Grimshaw and Ravenmore sought documents they believed she possessed. And somewhere in this web of secrets and half-truths lay the key to understanding who had truly destroyed her family, and why. The journal hidden in her chamber might hold that key, if only she could decipher its cryptic entries and incomplete accusations. But until she did, Serafina would have to navigate carefully between husband, mentor, and Viscount, each with their own agenda, each potentially dangerous in their own way. As she lay in her bed, sleep elusive despite the late hour, Serafina found herself thinking not of Ravenmore's offer or Grimshaw's calculating gaze, but of the Earl's troubled expression as he spoke of inconsistencies and doubts, of his hand, steady at her waist during their dance, of his warning, born of concern rather than jealousy. The man she had married was not the villain of her nightmares, but neither was he the hero who would restore her father's honor without complication. He was something more complex, more human, a man caught between duty and doubt, pride and principle. Whether she could trust him remained to be seen. Chapter 7. Unearthed Truths. Dawn had barely broken when Serafina heard urgent knocking at her chamber door. Clara appeared, her face pale with worry. "My lady, Mrs. Quicksilver requests your presence immediately. She says it cannot wait." Serafina dressed hastily, following Clara to the morning room where the housekeeper waited, her normally composed features drawn with anxiety. "Forgive the intrusion, my lady, but Lady Quillheart has arrived in great distress. She refuses to speak to anyone but you." In the small receiving room, Lady Quillheart paced like a caged animal, her travel cloak still dusted with road grime. When Serafina entered, the older woman rushed to embrace her. "Thank heavens you're safe," she whispered. "We must speak privately." Once alone, Lady Quillheart withdrew a folded packet from her reticule. "These documents belong to your father. I've kept them hidden since his arrest, as he instructed." Her hands trembled. "Yesterday, my home was broken into. Whoever searched my rooms was looking for these." Serafina stared at the papers. "What are they?" "Evidence. Records of transactions between Lord Grimshaw and French agents. Your father discovered the connection while auditing joint business ventures with the late Earl of Blackvale." Lady Quillheart's voice lowered further. "They prove Grimshaw framed your father for his own treasonous activities. Did you bring these to the authorities?" "I dared not. Grimshaw's influence runs deep in government circles. Your father tried that path and paid with his life." She pressed the packet into Serafina's hands. "But now, with your position as Countess of Blackvale, you might find protection enough to expose the truth." Serafina's mind raced. "Does the Earl know of these documents?" "I cannot say. His father suspected Grimshaw's betrayal before his death, but whether he shared those suspicions with his son..." Lady Quillheart shook her head. "The Earl was young, grieving, and Grimshaw quickly became his guardian in all but name. A perfect position to manipulate him into testifying against my father," Serafina murmured, pieces falling into place. Lady Quillheart gripped her hands. "Be careful, child. Grimshaw will stop at nothing to prevent these documents from coming to light, and I fear your husband's loyalty may still lie with his mentor." After Lady Quillheart's departure, Serafina retreated to her chambers to examine the documents. They matched and expanded upon the accusations in her father's journal, detailed records of payments, coded messages, and shipping manifests showing Grimshaw's treasonous activities. Most damning was a letter in Grimshaw's own hand, instructing an associate to duplicate Baron Thornvale's signature on incriminating correspondence. The letter was dated mere days after the old Earl's death. Serafina was still absorbing these revelations when Clara announced the Earl had returned from his morning ride and requested her presence in the library. She slipped the documents into her desk drawer, locking it carefully before making her way downstairs. The Earl stood by the window, his riding clothes still dusty from the road. "You received a visitor early this morning," he said without preamble. "Lady Quillheart, a family friend." "I'm aware of who she is." His tone was clipped. "What did she want?" The directness of the question gave Serafina pause. "She was concerned for my welfare." "Was that all?" His grey eyes searched her face. "Should there have been more?" The Earl moved closer, his expression grave. "Countess, if Lady Quillheart brought you documents or papers of any kind, I must know." Serafina's heart quickened. "Why would you think that?" "Because Lord Grimshaw's home was broken into last night. Certain papers were taken from his study." The Earl's jaw tightened. "He believes Lady Quillheart was involved. That's absurd. She's an elderly noblewoman, not a thief. Nevertheless, Grimshaw is convinced." His voice lowered. "He will be here within the hour to discuss the matter. If you possess anything that might be construed as his property, now is the time to tell me." Serafina studied her husband's face, searching for some indication of where his loyalties lay. Did he suspect the truth about Grimshaw? Was he genuinely concerned for her welfare, or merely protecting his mentor? "My lord," she said carefully, "if I did possess documents suggesting Lord Grimshaw had committed serious crimes, had in fact framed my father for his own treasonous activities, what would you do?" The Earl went very still. "Do you have such documents? Answer my question first." For a long moment he said nothing, conflict evident in his expression. Then, I would examine them thoroughly, and if they proved credible, I would ensure justice was served. Even against your mentor and guardian, truth matters more than loyalty to the undeserving. His voice was quiet but firm. Now, Countess, I ask again, do you have such documents? Before Serafina could respond, the library door burst open. Lord Grimshaw entered, flanked by Ravenmore and two men who were unmistakably not gentlemen. Forgive the intrusion, Blackvale, Grimshaw said, his cultured voice at odds with the violence of his entrance. But I believe your wife has stolen property that belongs to me. The Earl stepped between Serafina and the intruders. This is my home, Grimshaw. You do not enter without permission nor make accusations against my wife. Your wife is a thief and the daughter of a traitor. Grimshaw's mask of civility had dropped entirely. Stand aside. I have no quarrel with you, but I will reclaim what is mine. You will leave my house immediately. The Earl's voice was steel. Whatever grievance you believe you have can be addressed through proper channels. Grimshaw's laugh held no humor. Proper channels? Like the courts that condemned her father on evidence I provided? He turned to Serafina. Give me the documents, girl, and perhaps I'll allow you and your husband to keep your comfortable lives. I don't have your documents, Serafina replied, matching his cold tone, but I wonder what you fear they might reveal. Ravenmore stepped forward, his handsome face twisted with malice. Search her chambers. They must be there. You will not search anything in my home, the Earl said, his hand moving to the bell pull. My servants will show you out, or I shall have you removed forcibly. Grimshaw's pale eyes narrowed. You choose unwisely, Blackvale. I made you what you are. I can unmake you just as easily. You've made nothing but mistakes, it seems. The Earl pulled the bell, beginning with underestimating my capacity for independent thought. As footmen appeared at the door, Grimshaw smiled thinly. This isn't over. The documents will be recovered one way or another. His gaze shifted to Serafina. And those who harbor state secrets face the same fate as those who steal them. After they were escorted out, the Earl turned to Serafina, his expression grave. You must tell me everything, now. Rain lashed against the windows of Blackvale House as Serafina placed her father's journal and Lady Quillhart's documents before the Earl. His face grew increasingly grave as he examined each page. This is why my parents died, he said finally, voice hollow. Not fever, poison. Grimshaw needed them silenced before they exposed him. And my father was the perfect scapegoat, Serafina added. With both your parents gone, Grimshaw could manipulate you into testifying against him. The Earl's grey eyes met hers, filled with regret and determination. We must act quickly. Grimshaw will not hesitate to eliminate any threat to his position. A thunderous crash from the entrance hall interrupted them. Mrs. Quicksilver rushed in, face ashen. My lord, armed men are forcing their way inside. The Earl moved with surprising speed, pulling a pistol from his desk drawer. Take the servants' passage to the stables, he commanded Serafina. Ride for Lord Harrington's estate. He's a magistrate who can be trusted. I won't leave you to face them alone. This isn't a debate. He pressed the documents into her hands. These must reach safety. Justice for both our families depends on it. The sound of struggle grew closer. The Earl pulled a concealed lever, revealing a hidden door in the paneling. Go, now. Serafina hesitated only briefly before pressing her lips to his in a desperate kiss. Stay alive, Alaric. His eyes widened at her use of his given name. I will find you, he promised. The narrow passage led to the stables where a groom, clearly forewarned, had already saddled a horse. Serafina mounted quickly, the precious documents secured inside her coat. She was halfway down the drive when a shot rang out behind her. Ravenmore and his men had spotted her escape. Rain-slicked roads and darkness became her allies as she pushed her mount to its limits. Behind her, hoofbeats signaled pursuit. Ahead lay the crossroads, left to Lord Harrington's estate, right to Thornvale Manor, much closer and with hiding places only she knew. Serafina turned right. Thornvale loomed dark against the stormy sky, abandoned save for a skeletal staff. She dismounted at the kitchen entrance, startling the elderly cook who had served her family for decades. Miss Serafina, or I should say, my lady— No time, Serafina interrupted. Men are coming. Dangerous men. Hide yourself and deny seeing me. The East Wing, with its maze of interconnected rooms, offered the best sanctuary. Serafina locked herself in her mother's private study, slipping the documents into a hidden compartment behind a loose stone in the fireplace. Minutes later, the sound of breaking glass downstairs confirmed her pursuers had arrived. A floorboard creaked in the corridor outside. The door handle turned slowly. "I know you're in there, Countess," Ravenmore's voice deceptively gentle. "Open the door. Grimshaw only wants what's his." Serafina remained silent, searching desperately for a weapon. "Very well." Wood splintered as he forced the lock. As Ravenmore stepped through the doorway, pistol raised, another shot rang out behind him. He crumpled to the floor, revealing the Earl in the corridor, his own weapon still smoking. "Alaric!" Serafina rushed to him, noting the bloodstain spreading across his shoulder. "You're hurt." "It's nothing." He embraced her with his good arm. "Grimshaw?" Apprehended. Harrington's men intercepted him fleeing London. Relief flooded his features. "It's over, Serafina. Your father's name will be cleared. All that was taken will be restored." Outside, dawn broke through the storm clouds, casting golden light through the window. The first morning of truth after years of darkness.